please welcome Norfolk City Councilwoman and NewDEAL leader, Andria McClellan.
How's everybody today? Greetings from Norfolk, Virginia. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to be with folks throughout the country. I'm Andria McClellan, Norfolk City Councilwoman, representing a city that is home to the largest naval base in the world and home to the second busiest port on the East Coast. And why is that important and why does that matter in the discussion of climate? Well, we have 40 to 50,000 sailors who traverse our roads every day to get on and off that large naval base. And unfortunately, those arterial roads are often flooded as a result of sea level rise and increased precipitation events. The trucks that supply the goods to not only Virginia, but to the Midwest are often have difficulty getting on and off of that port because of our flooded roads. And quite honestly, moms and dads having the ability to get their kids to and from school or to and from their jobs, it's a real issue here in Norfolk. So the idea of addressing climate and the 2020 election is a very important and real issue here for Norfolk. And what we want to see in this upcoming election is action. We've talked a lot, we have lots of plans, but what we really need on the ground is the ability to see dollars and plans implemented so that we can get our families, our workers, and our military and the port working. So look forward to this great discussion today to see, to learn more about what's happening, and certainly looking forward to the November 3rd election where climate is going to be the top of my list and a lot of my voters' lists. So thank you for the opportunity to Third Way for being here. I'm here as a representative of the NewDEAL Leaders Program, very proud to be part of this pro-growth, progressive group of state and local elected officials, and proud for the NewDEAL partnership with Third Way. So thanks so very much. Looking forward to more discussion, and I'll let you take it away from here, Gerald. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman McClellan. We will now have a very special message from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island.
Hi, this is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and I am delighted to have this chance to share a few thoughts with you. I want to particularly thank the University of Michigan and Third Way for giving me this opportunity and for convening all of us to think about what comes next with respect to climate change. The first thing that I will say to all of you is that if Democrats win the Senate, particularly if we have a Democratic president in the White House, and if Speaker Pelosi keeps control over the House, we are going to go big on climate. There's just no doubt about that at this point. Many of us lived through the heartbreak of falling down on climate after Speaker Pelosi passed her cap and trade bill, and Democrats controlled both the White House and the Senate. That will never happen again. We will do a big, comprehensive bill. As we go about doing that, and this would be my second point, I think that it's valuable and perhaps even important to try to find a bipartisan way forward, because a bipartisan bill will be far more durable than a purely partisan bill. But the caveat to that principle has to be that the Republicans who are working with us have to be sincere and they have to understand the need for speed. If Republican participation becomes an excuse to slow walk things, just to jam up the works, put sand in the gears and draw things out and slow it down, then we're going to have to jettison Republican participation. We're going to have to be partisan about it. It would be unfortunate, but it would be much less unfortunate than failing to act at all. So bipartisan if we can, partisan if we must, but in all events, real. In all events, significant. In all events, targeted to actually succeed at the one metric that really matters, which is hitting the 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade window. We have got to be in that and as close to 1.5 as we can. So one of the tools, my third point is that one of the tools we need to consider is carbon pricing. It's going to be an important part, I think, of any bipartisan bill, because by my count, every single Republican or centrist group, think tanks, former Republican officials and so forth, everybody who's thought this problem through to a solution on their side has ended up pretty much in the same place, which is a revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon price. So carbon price is pretty central. It also has quite a lot of currency in the Senate. There are 4 separate carbon pricing bills offered by Democrats. Our deputy minority leader, Dick Durbin, just offered a new one of his own. So reports of the death of carbon pricing are highly premature. The last thing that I'll say about carbon pricing is that you have to understand that the fossil fuel industry right now is coasting on a massive, massive public subsidy. The International Monetary Fund is a very respected economic organization. They are not known to be particularly green. And they have calculated that the annual subsidy for fossil fuel just in the United States alone, every year, the annual subsidy for fossil fuel just in the US is $600 billion. It's going to be really hard just through programs to overcome that kind of an advantage that the fossil fuel industry has baked in for itself. Which takes me to my final point. If you're a fossil fuel industry with a $600 billion annual subsidy, you will do virtually anything politically to try to defend it. And that's what we have seen in Washington. There's not partisanship around climate change. When I got here in 2007, we had bipartisan climate bills, one after another after another. What changed was in January of 2010, when the Supreme Court issued the Citizens United decision, and big special interests like the fossil fuel industry were empowered to spend unlimited amounts of money in politics. And they quickly did so, and they quickly figured out how to hide that it was them, so that we now have what we call dark money, anonymously funded, huge mega donations into politics. And they used that power to stamp out any dissent on the Republican side. What looks like partisanship is actually the forcible capture of the Republican Party by the fossil fuel industry, which bent that party to its will. So that means what can be done can be undone. And it makes it incredibly important that people like Coke and Pepsi, like the big banks, like Cargill and other big agricultural companies, the companies that are forward-leaning in their climate activity, show up in Congress and lobby their values. Don't just speak their values, but lobby their values. Because what I see right now in Congress is that the fossil fuel industry is still hard at it through its front groups with its dark money, scheming to avert any serious climate legislation. And the rest of corporate America really doesn't show up. They talk about carbon pricing, they talk about climate change, but at the end of the day, when they send their lobbyists here, when they do their political electioneering, climate change is not on the program. Now we're at the cusp of that changing. We're at the very cusp of that changing. And the day that big ag and big tech and Wall Street and the big financial houses bring the values that they say to the public here to Congress, we're going to see such a rapid shift, it'll make your head spin. So there really is a path forward as soon as corporate America steps up and promises that it will give Republicans some real support if they cross the fossil fuel industry on climate. That means cleaning up their trade associations. It's disgraceful that Influence Map just described the 2 worst climate obstructors in America as the US Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. I mean, really, where were all the rest of their corporate members when the fossil fuel industry pulled that stunt? So there's enormous progress ahead of us. This is our time. We've got to make this happen, and it will happen way, way better if there's Democratic control of the Senate and the House and the Oval Office. Thank you for letting me share these thoughts. I wish you all well.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I'm Gerald DeWese. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor for Third Way's Climate and Energy Program. You all have heard my voice for the last 3 weeks, and now you actually get to meet me face to face for those of you who I've never met. You may be wondering why we're going to do an election assessment in the middle of a climate conference. Well, this election, as you've heard, is the most important election of our lifetime. And it's not just for all of the things you've heard because of the issues you've heard about, like racial justice and the COVID crisis, but it's also because of the climate crisis. You know, we have 2 candidates, one who denies the science and one who believes that we have to have an all-in strategy to defeat this crisis. So that's why we're doing an election assessment in the middle of a climate conference. So I'm going to introduce someone who's going to help me with this, and it's Matt Bennett, who's the Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way. Matt usually is a partisan player in politics, but today he's going to play the analyst role. And I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Matt Bennett.
Hey, Jared.
How's it going?
Going great.
Good, good. Thank you for joining us today. I was just telling everyone that, why we're doing an election assessment in the middle of the climate conference. And, it's the most important election of our lifetime. And Third Way has been doing a lot of research around who voters are and, why they matter and what interests they have. As far back as last summer, we released a poll that showed that most Democratic voters weren't on Twitter, and that we'd be misjudging the Democratic primary if we looked at the Twitterverse. Tell us a little bit more about that research and what we can learn from that research about the general election, because it turned out to be pretty prophetic.
Yeah, if you think back, now it seems like a million years ago to the Democratic primary in the summer of 2019, the pundits were saying that the Democratic Party had moved sharply to the left, and that they were concluding that in part because the very first thing that pundits do in the morning is they get up and they look at Twitter. And then they do that while they're eating breakfast. And then they do that right after they've gotten dressed, and it continues throughout the day. So what they're seeing on Twitter is having a huge impact on their view of how voters are actually thinking and behaving. And we did some deep research, public opinion research, both qualitative and quantitative, and found it just isn't the case. Only about 10% of people who were likely to vote in the Democratic primaries were ever on Twitter or posted anything about anything. Could be the NFL or Beyonce or anything, much less just being about politics. So what you see on Twitter, if you are a political person, it really conceals more than it reveals. It makes it seem like the Democratic electorate is about a lot farther to the left than it turns out that it was. And we were pretty confident throughout that there were 24 candidates in the race, that one of them that acted like Joe Biden, sounded like Joe Biden, would end up the nominee. And so we are unsurprised at the outcome. And I think what that means for us in the next 29 days is to be very cautious about drawing conclusions inside our own bubbles. Every one of us lives in a titanium bubble of our own making. Our social media, our friends, the mainstream media that we consume, and often that leads you down the wrong path. I mean, many of us were stunned and horrified by the outcome in 2016. We didn't see it coming because we live in these bubbles. And so we've been really trying with our research to poke our heads out and look around.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the other things that, one of the other research projects that Third Way has done is about the suburbs. Right. And we learned a lot about the suburbs, both through the research around Twitter, but also in the suburbs project. Tell us a little bit about who's in the suburbs, because there's this image in the media about who lives in the suburbs. And even Donald Trump has an image of who lives in the suburbs. But what our report found out was that the suburbs looks a lot different than what's in the media and than what the president believes. And
right.
the suburbs are really important into some key House and Senate races that could have an impact on who controls Congress in the next Congress.
They are. So more than half of voters live in suburban areas. So obviously more than rural and urban combined. And the suburbs look like the rest of America. They are just as diverse racially and educational attainment and in terms of income as America is as a whole. In fact, more voters of color live in the suburbs than live in urban or rural areas combined. What that means is that the suburbs don't look like the Leave It to Beaver suburbs that apparently the president thinks that they do. There is a huge diversity in the suburbs, and they will decide the election. They're the majority of voters, but they're also the overwhelming majority of persuadable voters, to the extent any are left at this point, but there were some at least several months ago. And what you see is voters in the cities vote overwhelmingly for Democrats by about 78%, and voters in the rural areas voted about the same percentage for Republicans. That was true in 2016. it's very hard to make progress when those voters are so set in their ways. But suburban voters do swing a little bit more. And when you saw the differences in suburban performance in the swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania between 2016, where Hillary lost the suburbs in those states, and 2018, where Democrats running for governor and House and Senate won them overwhelmingly, that really was the difference. Gerald, you're muted.
9 months later, and still here we are.
We all do it.
Right. So what are some of those key races that the suburbs are driving, particularly in the Midwest, like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania?
Well, they're certainly driving the presidential race, of course. There's some big Senate races all over the place, including a big re-elect race in Michigan that I'm sure a lot of the people on this call are watching very closely. And if you look at, for example, the Michigan suburbs, Hillary lost those suburbs. Had she done 1 point better in the Michigan suburbs in 2016, she would have won the state. She only lost the state by a narrow margin. But had she matched Gretchen Whitmer's performance when Whitmer ran for governor in 2018, if she'd matched her performance just in the suburbs, Hillary would have won the state by 350,000 votes.
Wow.
So the suburbs are huge. And so if you're looking at, Gary Peters' Senate race, if you're looking at some of the most hotly contested congressional races, most of those are happening in the suburbs. Now, of course, suburbs vary tremendously. Inner ring suburbs tend to be much more liberal, and outer ring and exurban areas tend to be much more conservative. And they are, unfortunately, fairly segregated. Suburbs as a whole are very diverse, but suburbs individually are fairly segregated. So you do have to look individually to see what the outcome is likely to be in those places.
Interesting. So I want to shift focus just a little bit. We've heard a lot about election insecurity in the last few months, from traditional voter suppression to maneuvers by the Trump administration causing uncertainty among voters regarding mail-in ballots. How concerned should voters be, and what real actions can the administration take to steal the election or cause mass uncertainty?
Look, I think we should all be very, very concerned about this attack on our democracy. I mean, they are taking an axe to the center tentpole of our republic, and they're doing it in a whole bunch of different ways. Some of them are very familiar. Voter suppression efforts, closing down polling places, particularly in communities of color, sending poll watchers. They're recruiting off-duty police officers and soldiers to go in open carry states, to go armed to these polling places, and essentially to threaten voters that are showing up to exercise their franchise. Erasing people from the voting logs. We saw that in Georgia, in particular, in Stacey Abrams' race for governor in 2018. And all of that is happening between now and Election Day and on Election Day. But equally worrying, maybe more, is the attack that they're going to bring after Election Day, because we all know that it's possible that we won't know the winner on election night. If it's a close election, we definitely won't know the winner because of mail-in ballots. And in states like Michigan, mail-in ballots cannot be counted until Election Day. Michigan just passed a law that allowed them to be processed, which means they can kind of sort them and look to see if they're flawed in some way, like missing signatures, but they can't be counted. And in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, nothing can be done to them until Election Day. So the likelihood is, unless there's a blowout, we won't know the winner. And it's possible that Trump will look like he's leading on election night because more Republicans are likely to vote in person than Democrats.
How legal are some of these pre-election efforts that they're doing?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of them are pretty legal. Like sending thugs to the polls is legal now because there had been a consent decree between the Republican Party and the Justice Department that expired in 2018, and now they can do that. Democrats are going to push back, and it depends on the state and the jurisdiction, but most of them are pretty legal. The scary thing, though, is if there is a period after the election where the vote count seems to be changing, which is to say the vote on election night with all the in-person balloting shows Trump ahead, and then the absentee ballots are counted and they begin to show Biden leading, then it's likely that the president and his allies will go to the courts to try to stop the count, or might even go to the state legislatures because they've got some constitutional authority to stop the count or even impose their own choices on the electorate. This is untested legal water. We think that courts probably won't go for this. This is a pretty facial violation of the 14th Amendment, but it could get very ugly.
So for those people who remember the 2000 election, how similar do you think that will be? And you have experience with the 2000 election.
I do. I worked for Vice President Gore in the White House, and I was with him on election night and in Nashville the next day. And I will say this, one thing we won't do again is no one had any idea that an election presidential election could essentially end in a tie. That was not a thing that we thought could happen. And I was asked by a senior staffer to walk around our headquarters on the day after the election and ask people if they were lawyers, because we were going to send the campaign plane down to Florida. That's not a good way of proceeding. We're going to do it a lot differently this time. A guy named Mark Elias is running a big project. He's the kind of lead lawyer for Democrats. And he already has a team of lawyers. They've got 2 former solicitors general. They've got Eric Holder, the former attorney general, working with them. There's a wide variety of outside groups, many of them nonpartisan, who are just interested in protecting the vote, that are engaged with this as well. So there's going to be a huge legal team ready to go. And I think there's going to be a political team as well, because as I say, it may involve state legislators trying to involve themselves in this process. And that's a political question.
Yeah. So you've been working in presidential politics since 1987. How different is this campaign than any other campaign you've seen?
Like 700 on a scale of 1 to 10. It is unbelievably bizarre in all the obvious ways, and mostly because one of the candidates is acting in ways that are not only unusual, but un-American by attacking our democracy so directly. I mean, he did it in the debate. No one could ever possibly have imagined anything like this. In fact, if you think about 2000, when that was the most severe test of our democracy in modern memory, the minute that the Supreme Court issued its ruling, my friend Chris Lehane, who was Gore's press secretary, got a page from Gore. We had alphanumeric pagers back in the early Middle Ages, and he got a page that said, from Gore, that said, please don't trash the Supreme Court. Because Gore was angry about the decision. All of us were. I still think it was wrongly decided, but he had tremendous respect for the kind of institutions that protect our democracy. And so he immediately that night conceded, and one of the most gracious and amazing speeches I've ever seen. And I encourage people to go back and watch it on YouTube. It's really a stunning example of selflessness in the protection of our democracy. None of that's going to happen this time. So while it's familiar to have a presidential race that's relatively close, maybe it's not close, we don't know, it is very unfamiliar to have one candidate acting this way.
Yeah. So, I mean, the cliche is that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Not only does it decide climate action, but it decides our democracy. Thanks for that, Bennett. Yeah.
I've been saying that every race pretty much since I started in politics, and I've always thought it was true, and now I know it's true. I mean, it's never been more true than now. There really hasn't been a race of this consequence since 1860. I mean, there just hasn't. Even if Herbert Hoover had won in 1932, it wouldn't have had the consequence that re-electing Trump would have on everything that we care about, very much including, and perhaps especially including, climate.
Yeah. Any optimistic words that you can leave with us?
Yeah, I think the election is going well. I know this is a 501c3 activity that we're engaged in here, but if you care about the climate, I think the election is going extremely well. And I will say this: I think Joe Biden's ad on climate change that I know is running in Michigan may be the first climate ad that has ever run in the general election of a presidential campaign. I'm not sure there's been another one. And I do know that Al Gore, who won a Nobel Peace Prize on this topic, didn't run ads on climate change, certainly not in Michigan. So things have changed a lot.
Yeah, and it's a really great ad if anyone hasn't seen it yet. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate you today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Please welcome Justin Worland, correspondent for Time Magazine.
Hi, thank you, Gerald. I'm so glad to be here in this panel. With this great panel, we have Heidi Heitkamp, who is a former US Senator from North Dakota and the founder of One Country, Brian Stryker, who's a partner at the polling firm ALG Research, and Sarah Mills, who's a senior project manager at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining this panel. I'm excited to talk a bit about what voters want. We're going to talk a lot about rural voters given the nature of this panel, but I want to start with you, Brian, maybe to just give us an overview. What do voters want in 2020 when it comes to climate policy?
Sure. Thanks, Justin. So, I would start by saying it's on the back burner given the obvious crises that we're dealing with as a country, the health crisis and the economic crisis. But that said, people do realize it's a problem. I mean, there's a growing sense. In the latest polls we've seen, about 3/4 of people understand that it's real and that we need to do something about it. What we need to do is up for debate, and the trade-off between economic pain versus doing something about climate. That's voters aren't there yet in a tough economic time. But sorry, there's a bunch of pounding in the background here. We're getting a roof put on, which is a perfect time to do that. But there's real concern about anything that's going to cost a lot of money, but they do want to see something done. And in particular, they want to see movement towards renewable energy, which they see as beneficial for reasons outside of climate, energy independence, economic benefit, costs, et cetera.
Right. Can you talk a bit, I mean, you mentioned sort of the issues of economic trade-offs. Maybe you can just talk a bit about, and the notion that voters don't want to make any trade-offs. Can you talk a bit about the messaging around this issue and how that's playing out on the campaign? Because the Biden campaign is talking about jobs and climate, while the Trump campaign talks about, climate's going to destroy the economy if we do anything. So can you talk about how those messages are playing?
Yeah, and I mean, I think you see an issue like fracking be a real wedge point on that. You've got 40% of people in the state of Pennsylvania live in a county where there is fracking going on, and there's a lot of economic benefits that your swing voter is seeing, and those places are places that were sort of narrowly for Romney and then heavily for Trump. So you do see, the Trump campaign trying to turn this into the same argument of 2016, which is that Democrats want to end fracking, they're going to take your jobs away, they want to kill coal, they want to kill gas. And you see an electorate that's pretty supportive of natural gas in particular, but particularly in the state of Pennsylvania. And that's not the only place in this election that's going to matter with a lot of fracking. But at the same time, the other thing that you see is this sense that sort of Trump isn't listening to the science, and that obviously is reinforced by other issues. We've seen pretty publicly this week. And that's sort of not a great look for him in the more suburban areas where you have a bunch of people who have college degrees that always voted Republican and are sort of wavering right now.
Right. Well, Senator Heitkamp, I want to go to you next. Thanks for being here. I want to ask about rural voters, and just to ask, from your perspective, what do rural voters want to see on climate in 2020?
Well, I think it's important to kind of look at a baseline, because I think a lot of people would assume that rural voters, at a greater percentage think it's a hoax, think it's overdone and overwrought. For most of the rural power is delivered through the rural electric cooperative organizations, and they are and have been in the past heavily invested in coal. And so coal is a big part of what they think is affordability, what they think is the opportunity to have electricity driven or delivered, and also American energy independence. So let's start just at that baseline. Even knowing that, when the rural electrics in North Dakota used to poll attitudes about climate and climate change, they would ask the simple question, do you think this is a problem that needs to be addressed? And even then, 65% of the people responding, now these would be their constituents, rural constituents, said they think it's a problem. And so we see that borne out in the polling that we did with Third Way. We see people acknowledging that there is, in fact, a climate problem. Now, do they see it as a climate crisis, I think is a different question. And if you see something as a problem, you have this idea, look, we can all get together and actually begin the process of deciding what we're going to do to address this problem. If you see it as a crisis, the investment, the sense that you need to make big investments and take bold moves is much more pronounced and enhanced. And so I would tell you, rural America sees climate as a problem. They see it, whether it is new weeds growing in our fields that we can't address and haven't had before. As my friend Senator Tester said, they see vomitoxin, which is a fungus that grows on wheat in parts of Montana where it's never been there before, where it's been wetter than what it would have been normally. And so I think in rural America, they see the effects of climate. They don't call it climate change. These are disturbing weather patterns. Even people climatologists in North Dakota have told me they don't talk about climate change, but they do talk about changes in weather and weather patterns. So with that said, what I would say is that because they don't see this as a crisis, they see this as a challenge and a problem, their solutions are not as bold. I mean, to say we're going to go to zero by X years, if they think that it would be disruptive to the economy, not just in rural America, but all across the board, they're not for, increasing energy prices or doubling energy prices to address the crisis. But they also see opportunity, and I think that's something that Brian talked about. Many farmers who are lucky enough to have wind towers on their property, they're paid a very handsome lease for that dirt, for the ability that the utilities have to put up wind towers, and we have a great wind resource in North Dakota. They also see with a change that may in fact direct caps on carbon emissions in this country, that farmers who could in fact be part of sequestration and keeping carbon or reinvesting carbon into the soil, see that as an opportunity for additional income stream. Now, I think one thing people forget is that, as Brian was talking about, you have many rural areas in Pennsylvania that have been revitalized as a result of fracking. That's true for almost all extraction of fossil fuels that leads to a economic revitalization of maybe more depressed rural areas of the country. And so I think that the importance is to make sure that people feel an economic security with this change and with this direction. And if we can do that, I think we can bring the entire country along on a very aggressive climate policy that will get us to net zero.
Right. Very, very interesting. Sarah, I want to turn to you. I mean, first maybe just tell the audience a bit about your work, which is very interesting, but then also to answer that question, what do rural voters think about climate policy and particularly renewable energy, and the role of renewable energy?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. So my work is to try to understand the range of state and local policies that facilitate and hinder renewable energy deployment. Most of that work is working in rural communities and helping them understand. I also have a lot of applied work that I do, working in rural communities throughout Michigan, helping them understand the pros and cons of renewable energy. And the importance of rural communities in achieving any kind of energy transition can't be underscored enough. So I sit in the city of Ann Arbor, a city that has a carbon neutrality goal by 2030. And there's a lot of things working with the city that I know we can do to help achieve that, within the boundaries of our city, but we just don't have enough land area to host enough solar or wind to be able to meet that goal. We're going to have to put renewable energy power plants outside the city's boundaries. And that's true across the board. You know, when you shutter a coal-fired power plant on that physical site, you know, you can't replace it with the same megawatts of solar or the same megawatts of wind. It's, you know, pretty much so much of the land use associated with renewable energy is concentrated at the point of production, the power plant itself. And so that means that these, you know, power plants spread over larger territories. Now that discounts the, you know, the oil fields and the coal mines, you know, that's separate on the fossil fuel side from the generation itself. So it, you know, to achieve any kind of transition, we're going to need utility scale power plants, and they're largely going to be put in rural communities. Right now, 90%, over 90% of wind projects are in rural communities. An increasing majority of solar projects are also there. And understanding how rural communities feel about renewables and about the policies related to renewables is really important, because those rural communities have a lot of discretion in most states over the land use rules that would decide whether or not a wind or solar farm can actually be built there. And so it's, if you want to see an energy transition, you really have to understand how the people in those rural communities that are going to make that possible feel about not just the technology, but also about the policies.
And so, and what do you, what is the feeling you get in your work talking to them? How do they feel about those policies?
Yeah, so, I mean, like Senator Heitkamp said, like wind development, solar development is largely an economic development opportunity for rural communities. And really, I mean, if you're not in an oil, in a shale play, effectively, like some of the biggest opportunity that rural communities have seen in a really long time. And so they're largely seeing it from an economic development perspective. A lot of the communities that I've, you know, when I go and talk before a local government and get questions about, you know, why their community is being selected. And oftentimes, you know, in places in Michigan, 1 or 2 wind turbines would be enough to satisfy the energy needs of the whole community. So what they want to know is, why are we being asked to host 50 of these, right? And the farmers say, like, this is great. This is economic development for us. And there are, in Michigan, tax revenues that come along with it that stay in the local government, which is fantastic. But often a question that I get is, isn't this to meet the state's renewable portfolio standard, the requirement, you know, that utilities right now in Michigan, that they get 15% of their power from renewable energy? And it's not seen as a positive. Usually that's seen as a strike against the wind farm or the solar farm in that community, because as portrayed to me, this is proof in some people's minds that these don't pay for themselves, right? That it's the government requiring this. And isn't that a policy that the people, what I hear is that the people in Detroit or Lansing or Ann Arbor, right? The liberal kind of places in the state of Michigan, that's their policy. Why don't they have these technologies there? And so, you know, our RPS in the state of Michigan is set to expire in 2021. I'm not sure what will happen after that, but from a community acceptance in the rural communities perspective, honestly, I don't think it's such a bad thing that policy sunsets.
Right. Well, I want to ask, I mean, I'm curious, I'll start with Senator Heitkamp, but I'm curious all 3 of your perspectives on this. How do you thread this needle? Because obviously national political leaders, people like Joe Biden, are talking about these big aggressive targets. And what we've sort of heard is that maybe that doesn't necessarily play so well to rural voters and perhaps, you know, other communities as well. So, you know, I'll start with you, Senator Heitkamp. How do you thread that needle? How do you both communicate that message on a national level and to communities that are very concerned, while also still reaching these local communities?
Well, I think the first thing is being completely transparent about what the goal is. I mean, I think everybody can say, oh, that makes sense, but how do you get there? And it's the how do you get there that really creates the challenge in rural America. If they say, you know, the Green New Deal means you get there by stopping all fracking or stop all development of fossil fuels. They're not going to buy into that. Number one, a lot of them have benefited. And you take a state like North Dakota, we not only have coal-fired power, but we have, you know, we're the second largest oil and gas producing or oil producing state in the union. And so, you know, we're going to be ground zero for a pushback. But with that said, the other way you get them is by showing them the economic development benefit, as Sarah was talking about, of making this change and say, if anything, rural America is going to be beneficial and get more benefits more broadly across the board for this transition. One of the other ways, and we haven't talked about this, is the continued development of biofuels. You know, whether it is biodiesel or whether it's ethanol. Ethanol, I know, has its detractors, but certainly the conflict that we have in states like North Dakota and Iowa between the oil industry and the ethanol or farming community, whether it's biofuels or whether it or biodiesel or whether it is ethanol, is something that's not well understood, I think, among the client activists. And it's something that can, in fact, be used to say, look, we're going to find a space for biofuels, which are by their nature renewable, as long as we're using inputs that are sensitive, whether it is sequestration of carbon and how we produce corn. I mean, there's just a whole lot of opportunities. We have to show people in, you know, not on the back of a napkin. We have to show people in real time what those opportunities are. Then you get the corn growers. Then you get the local RECs who say this is going to be beneficial to us. You have to grow that support by growing economic opportunity.
Can I jump in and just to totally agree with that? I think there are 2 points that I would emphasize. Is so we worked for Billy Sutton, who ran for governor in South Dakota and ran way ahead of the 30 points ahead of Trump. Now still lost by a couple, but it's a similar dynamic where being pro fracking is the price of admission and being pro pipeline, and you cannot be a Democrat and sort of be against those things and feel like you're going to have a shot. But it's not hard. And this is a guy who's a rancher, West River, South Dakota, and is perfectly comfortable talking to farmers and ranchers about wind and the benefits of it. And that's a very easy conversation. And similarly, we work for Cindy Axne in Congress, who much of her district is Des Moines area, is more cosmopolitan. But Western Iowa, I mean, she talks about bringing wind there all the time. And this is something she did in state government. And when the farmers start seeing it in their pockets, which they do, it just becomes a no-brainer. And people think that, one, it's going to pay for itself, right? Because the wind is free and the sun is free, which, like, I know that economics are, and two, they're going to get a benefit for people that also, by the way, have been getting killed on commodity prices because of the trade wars and a whole lot of other things. And when you start talking to some of these farmers that maybe go along with the trade war piece and sort of see, okay, there's benefits. Trump loses them when you start talking about the bio credits and the benefits to big producers and all that sort of stuff. And then you're taking money out of their pockets, hurting their ability to produce renewable energy. And then that's where agriculture, agribusiness, and environmental groups are completely aligned on that issue. And that's a pretty good place to be to get something done in rural America.
And I would just add in what who it is that are the supporters. Like, farmers are largely huge supporters of renewable energy. They stand to gain, right? Like, what a developer is looking for is land. And so the farmers and ranchers throughout, like, what I call the wind belts, right? Running from the Dakotas down through Texas, like that, like, this is a godsend. I mean, a lot of my work is what farmers do then with that revenue. And, they're reinvesting it in their property. Like, it's helping another generation of farmers see it as not such a risky business, right? Because it's a drought-proof, pest-proof crop. A lot of the work, though, right, for a true energy transition, we're going to need to build renewables not just in the center of the country. Like, as it gets closer to population centers on either coast, it's getting increasingly contentious. And one of the things that some of our work has turned up is acknowledging, wind development in the Midwest, the Great Lakes side of the Midwest and solar development increasingly is not a walk in the park. It's not like a slam dunk. There is a decent amount of opposition, community opposition to it. And some of our work is about understanding like what communities are more likely to oppose projects. And in the Midwest, you've got a mix of farmers and people who move to the country, right, to get out of the suburbia or out of the city. There's a lot of inland lakes that people have cottages and, you know, cabins on. And so we've done this study across 4 different states and actually find that Trump supporters are more likely to support renewables. Wind projects in really Republican communities are less contentious than those in places where the politics are a little bit mixed, because some of those, you know, urban transplants have they ascribe a different value to the landscape, right? They see more, they put more aesthetic value in that landscape than, you know, the kind of more productive values that we're seeing in a lot of the farming, ranching kind of communities. And so, and sometimes it's like politics that many people wouldn't expect. But if you spend enough time here, you recognize like that it depends on how you're selling it. You know, it depends on how you're talking about renewables.
Yeah, and you know, Ted Kennedy famously fought wind power in the Bay. And I remember one of my first times presiding over the Senate, my friend Lamar Alexander gave a speech against wind power and putting towers on the Smoky Mountains. And he said, it'll be over my dead body that you put those Cuisinarts in the sky on the Smoky Mountains. And so, you know, you've got a really mixed bag, but I do want to add one thing. In North Dakota, we have an incredible challenge right now that is wrongheaded in stopping the development of wind because people believe it's retribution for what's happening to coal. And so it's complicated in a state like North Dakota that has been a big fossil producer, as opposed to locating those same wind towers in South Dakota, which hasn't had an advantage with additional revenue or economic activity from coal generation or from oil and gas.
Wow, some really interesting insights here. I want to ask a bit about weather and the extreme weather that we've had across the country. You know, drought, it's, you know, the extreme flooding in many parts of the Midwest. And I just want to get, you know, any perspectives on how this shapes voter opinion in 2020. I mean, for, you know, all of us, we recognize, you know, the pandemic and all these other things that are happening to us. But for many people, you know, their farms are flooded or, you know, they're suffering from drought and other things. So I just, maybe we'll start with Brian, but, you know, anyone can chime in, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard because the pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it just dominate everybody's thinking so much. I mean, as we all sit here in our houses, but it really is dominant. And when something like the wildfires in California, like they do kind of break through, you know, and when there's when there's localized issues, you know, we certainly saw that in Iowa, for example. They had the derecho recently. But that just tends to be pretty local. Now there is a sense, people do have a sense that you're seeing extreme weather more and more, and it's a pretty persuasive argument for why to do something about climate. It is not a persuasive argument about why to do something about renewables, because the things people want about renewables, they want energy independence, they want, you know, the economic benefits and all those sort of things. But it gets you some purchase, and you know, you see this after a hurricane or after a hot summer and these sort of things. And I do think it's why things are moving over time, because people are seeing these things. But it is hard to convince someone if they haven't seen it, like pointing to these and saying, aha, see all these events and they're all connected. Because if they're not seeing a pattern and they don't want to see a pattern, like they won't see it. So yeah, it's like marginal and long moving, I think.
Interesting. Do either of you have thoughts?
Mine is not so much from a rural perspective, but just, you know, some of my work is with cities in Michigan that are kind of leading on climate. And I can tell you, like, this has, you know, the natural disasters that we're seeing has certainly fired up the idea of like voting, like being climate voters. Across the city of Ann Arbor, there are people with like yard signs, not for a candidate, but that say, I am a climate voter. Like there are increasing numbers of cities that are passing, you know, carbon neutrality policies. And so I certainly think, and in Michigan, you know, it's not wildfires here. Instead, it's, you know, increased intensity of rainfall. But like cities, like the storm water systems are having troubles keeping up. And so I think that is both among kind of urbanites, but also among, I can tell you, among college students that, you know, I get to speak to after this, like they are extremely, like this is extremely motivating to them.
Yeah. And I mean, so we pull for the governor, and the dam breaking in Michigan was definitely a factor too. There was a natural disaster on that. I think it is a little bit more of an Ann Arbor thing than like a, you know, Flint or Saginaw thing or something. So a little bit more like progressive college town thing. But yeah, it's real among, and we saw it in the primary too. I mean, Democratic primary voters, it was like a number 1 or 2 issue for them. Less true among swing voters, and also just it's gone down now because, well.
Right. I think it's important to point out that there is a reason why Congressman Minority Leader McCarthy came out with a climate plan, because they're going to lose young voters. And so, you know, we can talk about how we're going to dice up this demographic on climate, but it is a critical issue and an important issue for young voters. And I spend a lot of time with young voters talking on campuses, and you see it over and over and over again. They're absolutely convinced that there won't be a planet that will be inhabitable. And we know the consequences of climate migration, whether it is out of Northern Africa into Europe. I mean, all of these things are real. And I think the question is whether people see it in their daily lives. And the more you see these extraordinary weather events, whether it's the 500-year flood happening every year, people start going, there's something going on here that is not normal. And it's not just harsh weather patterns, it's a change in how we do business. I want to recommend to everybody, John Tester wrote a book called Grounded, and it's got a whole chapter on what he's seen in his neck of the woods in Montana in terms of weather changes and what that has meant to the economics of rural America. And so the more people who talk about it from that perspective, I think the more people will kind of connect the linear dots. Oh yeah, this is happening and this is why it's happening, as opposed to this is just something we have to live with because weather is always a problem for a farmer or for rural communities.
Right. We have just really 3 minutes left, and I just want to maybe close asking Senator Heitkamp your thoughts about what do you were in the Senate, what do you think if we imagine a world where if the polling is correct, Biden wins and there's a narrowly controlled Democratic Senate, what do you imagine might go through on climate? What could you imagine?
I think that you know, as much as you would like climate to be a standalone lead the issue debate, I think that what Biden's going to be dealing with is the pandemic and you know, kind of the healthcare crisis, but then the economic renewal. And that's really where we're going to see climate taking a front seat. You know, what do we do for investments? How do we create, as Sarah was talking about, more resiliency within communities for stormwater runoff? You know, this is not going to go away. And then how do we invest in technologies? And I think it's no surprise to the people who know my role in all this that I've been very active in the area of carbon capture and sequestration. We can't get to where we need to go without developing those technologies. We've seen a lot of really great information and technologies being delivered on air capture. I think we're gonna have a moonshot on climate technologies embedded with resiliency investment, embedded with a long-term goal for reduction of carbon that may get tangled up in the Paris Climate Accords, but will achieve a dialogue because Republicans aren't completely stupid. they're looking at the polling and they're realizing if they're going to survive into the next generation of voters, they have to have a plan and they have to be cooperative.
Right. Well, with 2 minutes left, I just want to give you both, if you want any closing thoughts, Sarah and Brian, if there's anything else you want to just mention quickly.
No, I mean, as always, I agree with the senator. Like, if this is not a jobs program, it's not getting done. Like, it's if we're going to people and saying, well, there's going to be some pain, but it'll be long-term economic benefit, people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this has to be framed as a jobs program.
I would just make the pitch that I think what happens at the federal level is really important. It's at the local level that it gets implemented, right? Like that we actually have to build those things. And maybe this is just my land use planner coming out. Like, land use planning is a local activity. Like, you know, that's a lot of governments to deal with. And so I think that, you know, getting enough communities to say yes to these projects is really important. And my sense is one of the key ways to do that is looking at tax policy and how those revenues stay, how much they stay in local communities and are in things that are really visible, because then it's not just the farmers that are benefiting, it's the whole community.
Great. Well, we are just out of time. Thank you so much to the panel. A very interesting insight about voters, particularly rural voters. So thank you again, and I'll kick it back to Gerald.
Thank you, Justin, Sarah, Brian, and Senator Heitkamp. We appreciate you. Please welcome Lisa Friedman, reporter for New York Times.
Thank you so much, Gerald, and thanks to Third Way for having me. I am very pleased to have a fireside, as it were, a Zoom side chat with two of the smartest people I like to turn to help understand Washington and energy and climate policy. We're going to be speaking with Heather McTeer Toney, the National Field Director of Moms Clean Air Force. She is the former Southeast Regional Administrator for the EPA under former President Obama. And Mike Catanzaro, the President and Chief Policy Officer of CJCN. He is also the former Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Energy and Environmental Policy under President Trump, and he also served on President Trump's White House National Economic Council. Greetings to you both. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You know, we were emailing this morning, and you know, I mean, given the overwhelming focus, you know, obviously, you know, with good reason, right now on the president, his health, coronavirus, and the fallout from the economic fallout from coronavirus. I'd love to get both of your thoughts on just what we expect to see in this final stretch of campaigning between President Trump and former Vice President Biden on climate change. Is climate change a dead issue from here on out? Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks again, Lisa, and thanks to Third Way and Heather. Nice to be with you on the call. No, I don't think it's a dead issue at all, and certainly not from I would suspect from the Biden campaign perspective. I do think from President Trump and his campaign, the way they think about climate change, they think about it just the way I suppose Biden does. They think about it as an economic issue, but they principally look at it through the lens of domestic energy production and making sure that domestic energy production can continue and that the United States maintain its global leadership, particularly in oil and gas production. And so I think if climate comes up as an issue from that side, from the Trump side, they're going to be focused on individual battleground states. And they're going to be using, I think, the Biden climate policy, particularly in Pennsylvania, where they've been trying to go on the attack on Vice President Biden to say that he would ban fracking. He's certainly said, I'm not going to do that by any stretch. I think Vice President's been on the defensive a bit, but I think it's actually working for him. He's coming out, he's talking to union voters. I think just this morning, I think the operating engineers out of Pittsburgh said that they were going to endorse Vice President Biden. So I think he's using kind of his blue collar roots to push back pretty hard on that. And I think the polling, at least in Pennsylvania that I've seen on the fracking issue, has the President Trump and former Vice President Biden pretty much tied on the fracking issue. But again, I think that's how you're going to hear, at least from the Trump side, climate change coming up as an issue, using the Green New Deal, trying to tag President Biden or Vice President Biden with that program and saying that that's going to cost jobs in places like Pennsylvania.
Thank you. And we'll come back to the Green New Deal for sure.
Sure.
Heather, we saw an ad from Vice President Biden today on climate change. Does this remain front and center for him? Where is this on his, you think, priority list campaigning going forward?
No, absolutely, Lisa. I think to answer that question real quick, yes, just hands down, yes. There's no other reason we would have seen 11 minutes of climate in a discussion in the first debate when nobody thought it was going to be an issue. It's certainly showing itself that it's not only an issue that voters are concerned about, it's one that they want answers and a plan about. And I think that's what, Biden has a leg up on, and we're going to see over the next 4 weeks of final campaigning. The thing that I think Biden and Harris both add to this that we have not seen from the Trump campaign and people are actually looking for, and that's the inclusion of talking about equity when we're talking about climate solutions, talking about justice and equity and weaving it into every part of the climate plan, because it's certainly a critical thing that folks and voters particularly are looking for in their solutions to not only how we're resolving the climate crisis, but how we're wrapping it to every social justice issue of our time. So, when we look at the Biden climate plan and we look at some of these key spaces where he is campaigning, he's talking about not only a connection between climate and health, and in terms of recovery and how we're going to talk about a green recovery, how we're going to get our jobs back, but also the avenues of innovation, of equity, of making sure that we are talking about correcting environmental injustices and economic development. I think the last panel really drove that issue home. This is about jobs. This is about economy. It's about people really being concerned and wanting to know solutions. And that's what the Biden climate plan does. So I'm really excited to see these next 4 weeks. I think we're going to see climate a lot.
And, in tandem with a focus on environmental justice, one of the things that I've noticed consistently with Mr. Biden in his speech the other week on wildfires, and today with this ad that he put out focusing on cherry farmers in Michigan, and the vulnerabilities that their crops are going through due to climate change. He has been hammering in on the suburbs. I wish I should have written down the line before I mentioned it here, but in his speech, the other week, he painted a picture of more wildfires in the suburbs, more floods in the suburbs. Mike, do you have a sense that is resonating as both these candidates sort of fight to capture whatever swing voters there might be? I'd assume it sounds like they are, Republican women in the suburbs. How well do you feel that message is working among moderates and swing voters?
Well, I guess I'll pivot to the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy. I think there's a very good reason that early this year he, instructed his conference to come up with a climate plan. And now that climate plan is radically different, I think, from what Biden and the Democrats are putting together. But nonetheless, I think it's instructive that he felt like if, number one, he wanted to get the House back, and number two, wanted to be successful more broadly in this election and in future elections, particularly with young people, that the Republican Party needs to have a more cohesive, coherent, effective message, particularly to reach the young people. So, and again, his members, he's got a number of members in the suburbs, and he looked at the 2018 race and saw what happened and saw that the Republican Party really took a beating in the suburbs. And so climate is one of those issues that is popping up, as you say, the suburban moms, Republican moms, asking the question about it and showing up in polls. So Republicans are starting to get it. And again, I think McCarthy put together a pretty good plan, and his members have something to talk about. So you'll see more of that, I think, from the Republican side going forward.
Is that what is behind, you think, the president's rebranding of himself as, he called himself the number one environmentalist since Teddy Roosevelt recently. He seems to be sort of playing down his focus on deregulation and playing up his desire for clean air, clean water. Is that, what's the political thinking there? Who is he trying to win over?
My sense is the political thinking there is fairly narrowly focused on Florida. And so I think that the executive order basically saying we're going to take a pause for 10 years in offshore drilling in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. I think also he looked at South Carolina, probably looked at Lindsey Graham's numbers a bit and thought, well, maybe we should extend it there. I think North Carolina, Tom Tillis was another good move, probably going to extend it to Virginia in terms of this offshore drilling ban for the next 10 years. Again, the political calculus there was very clear. In Florida, the opposition to offshore drilling is just across the board for oil and gas, and it's Republicans, Democrats. I've never seen anything like it on an energy and environment issue where you can get in the House all the Republicans and all the Democrats to sign a letter to say we don't want this. And so for President Trump to come out and do what he did, I think it wasn't a surprise. So I think that's what's driving part of that message. But he saw it as an opportunity to talk more about the environment. But I don't think you're going to hear much more from him on that in the closing weeks of the campaign.
Heather, do you see this having any impact where you are? I mean, are folks swayed by a sort of greener message from the Trump administration than we've seen the previous 3 years?
You know, it's interesting, you know, Lisa and Mike, because we're talking about the same groups of people, seeing how they receive that message is really interesting to see on the ground. So, for example, looking at North Carolina, looking at Michigan, looking at Florida, even, and particularly the suburban areas, how suburban moms or how young voters are receiving this message of the having the cleanest water, being an environmental president. And I don't necessarily agree that he is, but you know, hey, that's me. What they're seeing, what they're hearing, and what they're seeing on the ground is two different things. So for example, in North Carolina, where you have significant impacts from CAFOs, from the controlled animal feed operations, where people are certainly being impacted in both of their air and their water. It's no longer just limited to some of the rural communities, but it is getting out into the suburbs. Suburban families are now experiencing toxic air. They're experiencing the pollution that previously they may have thought was limited to certain areas for whatever reason. Now, because of the impacts of climate, because of oil and gas production, because of where we're seeing these elements really, I think, bolster across our country, people are recognizing that they're feeling it different and they're seeking information. They want to know that there's a plan, a solution. So that's why I think when you talk to voters that are in suburban Pennsylvania, they don't necessarily want to see more of these operations come up because they're now physically experiencing these impacts that they previously did not think would come to them. And that's a big difference. And I think folks are definitely considering it when they're thinking about how they're going to vote.
Interesting. And Heather, let me stay with you for a moment. I mean, President Trump has been sort of hammering the Green New Deal on sort of both sides. He has on the one hand been mocking the vice president as losing the left because he won't support the Green New Deal, but also raising the specter of taking away your cows and your airplanes. But how is Mr. Biden threading this needle right now? I mean, when we hear him on debates and on the campaign trail, he uses every variation. I've heard many variations of Green New Deal, Green Deal, New Deal, but a careful delineation from the package put forward by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other Democrats. What is the needle that he has to thread this last month on the Green New Deal?
Well, I think, you know, he's got to stay focused on what his plan is, and that's what he was trying to get to. And they did something really smart. You know, the campaign really looked at not just the Green New Deal. I think the Green New Deal is a part of the foundation of how the plan is built, but the Biden team really spent a lot of time on the ground talking to not just the folks with Green New Deal, but Sunrise Movement, environmental justice leaders across the country, moms. They really went to a lot of different folks to get their thoughts and ideas of how do we move to 100% clean energy future? What do we need if we're going to get there by 2050? What are the benchmarks? And so I think you'll find that everything it's a nice mix of things. And while Trump is going to continue to say, oh, this is Green New Deal, and if you don't say it, then you're going to lose a part of that base, that's not necessarily true, because the base already knows that Biden already came to us. Biden already talked to us about the different things that we want to see. And we certainly understand and respect that he's pulling all of these things together to create a plan that is workable and implementable in the future. And that's what's important. What can we get done on day one and within the first 100 days? And that's going to take a lot of different options.
Well, that's a really good segue into implementation. Let's turn to what a second Trump term would look like on climate change and energy, and what a Biden administration might look like, and how some of these policies get enacted. Mike, what's left to deregulate? What are some of the things that we might see in a second Trump term?
Yeah, I do. I think so. A couple of things to think about in terms of a second term. Right now, a number of the deregulatory measures that have been undertaken have been litigated. No surprise. And so that litigation, if President Trump wins, will play out over the next 6, 12, 18 months. Some of it may even go to the Supreme Court. So we'll see how that turns out. But I do think that the Trump administration is going to have to spend a good part of that second term dealing with court decisions, whether they get remands from the DC Circuit, or DC Circuit vacates key parts or all of certain regulations. The NEPA reform rules are pretty controversial. I suspect that will come back in some form. So that's going to take a lot of time and effort to go back to dot I's again and cross T's. And of course, you're going to get litigated again. So you're going to have to deal with that. And that's one of the disadvantages of trying to enact policy administratively without having to deal with Congress. And I would think if President Trump is reelected, he's not going to have the luxury of dealing with a Congress where he can get legislation through. So it's all going to be administrative. In terms of what's left to deregulate, I do think that individual agencies will continue to work on regulating or deregulating or fixing, reforming how individual agencies do policy, personnel issues, science and cost benefit issues. And I do think more broadly that the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is at the Office of Management and Budget, is thinking hard about how do we continue to push administration-wide regulatory reform measures. So modeled off of, for example, Executive Order 13771, the one in and the two out. So if you have a new regulation that you promulgate, you have to take 2 off the books. Regulatory budgeting, a lot of those types of ideas, bringing in independent agencies more into the fold and requiring them to do cost-benefit analysis. Those sorts of measures, I think you'll see more in the second term. Paul Ray, who's the acting director right now of OIRA, has a lot of ideas that he's thinking about. So I don't think you're necessarily going to see as much specifically coming out of places like EPA or DOI or DOE. You're going to see it coming out of the White House and OIRA, and deregulating or reforming how agencies do regulations in the future.
And how about on climate change and climate science? I mean, a lot of the efforts, I think, in the first term were somewhat thwarted. The National Climate Assessment still came out. The red team, blue team idea, got chucked away, a cup first under Pruitt and then, kind of under Happer. We still hear NOAA and NASA use the words climate change, give reports on extreme weather events and heat. How much does, but there have been hires, at NOAA recently of folks who are climate deniers. How much do we expect, or would you expect an effort to, to address climate science in a second Trump administration?
Well, we will have another national assessment that's coming out, so they will have to deal with that, and I hope they don't deal with it in sort of a ham-handed, sort of clumsy way where, you know, as you say, there's some hires that they've made, and I think it would be foolish in the extreme if those hires felt like they could intervene and thwart or try to undermine the science that's being undertaken, because everyone will know about it, right? Number one.
Yeah.
And then number two, it's probably just not a wise thing to do from, you know, an overall scientific perspective. There are issues with respect to what you focus on and what you emphasize in those reports in terms of the different scenarios that you look at. Do you look at more extreme scenarios? Do you put emphasis on those as opposed to more middling scenarios? For example, with the IPCC, the question about RCP scenario 8.5, I think a lot of scientists are saying, well, maybe that's not that's more extreme. Maybe we should be focusing on impacts more in the middle of the range. Those are types of questions that are very legitimate, I think, for the administration to be thinking about. But I would be surprised if there was some coordinated effort, maybe at a part of the White House, to go to NOAA and NASA and try to dictate what the scientists are doing. I don't suspect there are any staffers that I know of at the White House right now who would be foolish enough to do something like that. So the scientific work product that you would expect and supposed to come out according to statute, that will come out. It will come out relatively uninhibited. Again, how it gets communicated, that will be a question as well. And, you know, Lisa, I know in your business, you'll be looking at that very closely, but the communications effort will be important. But I don't expect, again, that there's going to be some sort of obstruction or some sort of grand plan to undermine what the scientists are doing at these agencies.
Heather, I want to invite you to comment on any of that, but also, you know, I'd like to think about what a potential Biden administration could do if we're, you know, as Justin mentioned in the last session. I mean, we, as the polls stand now, we're looking at the Senate possibly flipping with a narrow majority. What is it that Democrats can do? What is it that can get done on a bipartisan level? How, you know, what part of, how does a Biden plan get enacted?
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Listen, and I'll try to address them both really quickly, Mike. You know, I agree. I think that I hope you're right, Mike. I really do. I hope that they are not foolish enough to try to undermine the science in the same way sometimes we see what's happened with CDC and what's happened with coronavirus. Like, we really, really hope that the science it is holding, because that's one of the first concerns, is that there's been such a censorship of the science that by the time the next reports are due to come out, just the wisdom within the agencies that are putting this information together is just not there. And so there's certainly a concern there. There's certainly a concern with respect to the litigation that is anticipated within the next 4 years, and understanding what's happening with the Supreme Court right now, what that litigation would look like in the various circuits that it would appear in front of, as well as potentially before the Supreme Court. And then I'd say finally, the concern that I have is that in a continued Trump administration, what happens on the state level, that there is continued intimidation, like what we see in California, with a move and really push for state legislatures to continue the same type of deregulation on a state and local level that we've seen on a federal level, either even further harming and taking away some of the really important resources that states have put together in order to ensure things like energy efficiency, fuel economy for their own respective places. So those are some of the things that I think about. I think on the Biden side, what we can look forward to, even with a very slim Democratic majority, I think there are definitely opportunities to work bipartisanly, very strategically though. And that's with the understanding that in the next 4 years, we're all going to be very focused on economic recovery from coronavirus, as well as climate impacts, and making sure that we are protecting ourselves and reducing our carbon emissions, and really looking towards clean energy, and as well as innovation and efficiency. So for a Biden administration, the implementation is tying these things together. It's ensuring that the climate plan, clean energy, talking through, again, correcting some of the environmental injustices, making sure that we are really thinking through equity and what that means in communities, is implemented in every single sector of the economy. It's implemented and really fleshed out through every aspect of economic recovery. So any economic recovery package. I think the way that we really have to work bipartisanly is to talk through the economics of it. Certainly we have been dealt a hard blow with coronavirus, and as a result, our economy just isn't strong. So tax incentives is going to be a big conversation. How much we're spending on these things. We'll certainly have to have some really strong conversations and need some really good bipartisan leadership in order to make that happen. But I think we can do it.
So what you're describing is really so fundamentally different than what we saw in 2009, right? Where the Obama administration came in, first they had to deal with the economic crisis. And yes, there was money for clean energy in the recovery package, but first it was recovery, then it was healthcare. And by the time Congress got around to climate change, there wasn't a huge amount of political capital left to get that over the finish line. Is that a lesson that, you know, from your conversations with the Biden team that has been discussed or internalized? Is that part of the thinking of embedding climate change in everything to avoid what?
Lisa, I will tell you, you can't get away from it. I was a mayor at the time, and I will never forget sitting in those ARA, those American Recovery and Reinvestment Act meetings, and just talking about how we needed to have shovel-ready projects ready to go in order to really see the economy turn around, and lessons that we learned from local government officials, and even later through, as I became a federal official, is understanding how it works on the ground. And it's exactly what Sarah was saying before. It is the implementation happens on the ground. The tax incentives have to be felt by the people who are on the ground. And I think that's certainly something the Biden administration has not only learned from 2009, but is seeing how we leverage all of these aspects. So it's why we will see and have a conversation about getting to 100% clean energy by 2050 with these benchmarks in between, but how funds that are used in a community can be leveraged to also not only create innovation and jobs for that community, but also talk about resiliency, infrastructure, addressing health impacts. And there's some good best case scenarios that we have learned from all across this country. You know, I think about Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is a great example of how you can take funding from EPA, workforce development dollars, and leverage it and turn it into healthcare, turn it into education, also resiliency and cleanup of a Superfund site. So it's really tying, I think the way that they're looking at this is tying together private development for government and then community, such that we have sustainable progress and everyone is a part of this moving forward. So it gives people buy-in, and that's absolutely something that they have to have, but also a lesson that was learned from 2009.
That's great, thank you. Since we are a panel that can use geeky phrases like RCP 8.5, and our audience knows what we're talking about, I'm going to use our last moments to talk about the Clean Power Plan and the ACE rule, which there will be oral arguments on Thursday. And you know, while we don't have time to get into the weeds of that, you know, I'd like to ask both of you, you know, if there is a Biden administration, do you see a Clean Power Plan 2.0, or you know, what is the way that that a Biden administration most practically can meet this goal it has set out in its plan of eliminating emissions from the power sector by 2035? What's the likelihood of using this regulatory tool under the Clean Air Act that has been the subject of so much back and forth in the courts again? Mike?
Yeah, you know, Clean Power Plan 2.0, I mean, it's difficult to do if you're thinking about it purely under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, which is what the Clean Power Plan and the ACE rule, that's the basis of that regulation. And Supreme Court, of course, as we know, stayed the Clean Power Plan, which means in legal terms that they thought that it stood on very shaky legal ground. They thought that the plaintiffs had a high likelihood of success on the merits. So you wouldn't want to go back maybe to that section in the act, because I think that if the Biden administration pursues that, they want to get significant reductions from the power sector. In order to do that under 111, you're going to have to go beyond the fence line, as it's called, right? And I think that is one of the key legal issues. That's the central legal issue under Section 111, whether you can go beyond the fence line to get reduction from the power. And so I think to reduce that risk or avoid that risk entirely, you want to look at other sections under the Clean Air Act. Two that I've seen a lot written about of late are the NAAQS program, Section 108, 109, 110, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Typically, NAAQS are designed to deal with local air pollution, local air quality issues. But, you know, legally, could you get away with setting a NAAQS standard for greenhouse gases, which those are global pollutants? Maybe. It has not been tested in court. The advantages, I suppose, is it allows you to set a standard. Setting what the standard would be difficult and complicated, no question. But it allows each state to do state implementation plans to figure out how they can come into compliance with that national standard. So that would be one way to say each state is different and they can come up with different ways of meeting it. The other is, if you don't want to go through the NAAQS program, which again, admittedly is fairly complex, you could try Section 115, which is an international provision, which allows you, if you have what's called reciprocity with another country, if they have similar environmental protections in place to those in the US. And one would argue that if the Biden administration gets back into Paris, which I think they probably would, that the Paris umbrella or framework would allow you to use 115. And again, it's the same sort of state implementation SIP framework that allows each state to come up with their own implementation plan. So you could go down that path. Again, litigation would ensue and it would very likely go back to the Supreme Court. You just have to kind of roll the dice a bit to see whether it goes through. Now, here's one advantage. If you write it in such a way that it doesn't get stayed by a court or blocked by a court, and you allow to implement it while the litigation is playing out, you can really influence behavior in a very significant way. Maybe after 2 or 3 years down the road, it gets vacated, tossed out, what have you. But in the meantime, you force people to make some very important decisions about investments and emission reductions for the future. So remains to be seen, but there are options for the Biden administration going forward here.
Thank you, Mike. Heather, what do you think? Does a Biden administration take us down this regulatory path again to meet the most ambitious mitigation part of its climate plan?
I think we're certainly going to take a look. I think there's definitely going to be some hard looks at not only not going backwards, because we certainly don't want to go, we don't use this as an opportunity to look back, but to see, okay, what are the opportunities that we have moving forward in order to meet these guidelines that we have. And you know, while, yes, this will be litigated, and not to rehash everything that Mike, I think those were some really important points that I want to pick up on the fact that we cannot, and I don't think the Biden administration would ignore the fact that there are significant investments that have already been made, right? And so the industries have already put a lot into procedures in having infrastructure in place in order to meet these standards, as previously they were intending to do before there was this entire attempted overhaul of the plan. So I think that all of these things taken into consideration, certainly we want to look at how we're going to be moving forward, how we're reducing these emissions overall in a way that keeps us out of having to go back and forth to court, and in the process taking advantage of these wise investments that have been done, the things that the companies have done well, and supporting them in that moving forward.
Both of you, I can't thank you enough. This has been such a good deep dive discussion. Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, Mike. And I hope that you both have a wonderful day. And thank you, listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Mike.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Lisa, Heather, and Mike. Please welcome Todd Allen, Chair and Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences at the University of Michigan, and Josh Freed, Senior Vice President for Third Way's Climate and Energy Program.
All right. Hi, everyone. I just want to say thanks. Thanks to everyone who spent the last 4 weeks participating in these conversations with us. Really appreciate your participation. I'm glad that the University of Michigan and Third Way have gotten together to have these conversations. And I think they're really important conversations at a really important time. We've talked about what's at stake in climate. We've talked about the importance of innovation, not only technology innovation, but policy innovation and social innovation. We've talked about the importance of jobs. We've talked about the importance of equity. And I think we've made the point that moving forward on these discussions and taking action from these discussions is important to do now. Couple other things, if people like this, that you might be interested in. The University of Michigan Energy Institute this Thursday and Friday is having their annual conference on transportation, economics, energy, and the environment. So if you're interested in clean mobility, it's a similar online event. Please join. And for Michigan staff, we've sent out notes, but on the 27th of October, we're going to have something called Clean Energy Conversations. We want to keep these conversations going within the university and then hopefully expand them up to outside partners. So just put those on your calendars. So in my last little bit of thanks, as I turn it over to Josh, on a personal note, I just want to say a couple of years ago, we sat down and we said, we really need to be having conversations about climate. We need to be having conversations that recognize the important, complex, interdisciplinary nature of addressing climate. And I think we've done this twice. It's gotten better each time. And we're pointing out the important issues, right? It's about jobs, it's about equity, and it's about continued innovation and getting better at this. So I value our partnership. I look forward to doing more. As I turn it over to you, I just say thanks. Glad we did this and look forward to more.
Thanks, Todd. And thank you to the University of Michigan and to Gerald and the entire Third Way team who worked with the University of Michigan so well in putting this together. We certainly wish we were out in Ann Arbor right now, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do this in person. However, I think the luxury of having 4 weeks and 4 consecutive Tuesdays to engage in such a diverse set of conversations, has really been fantastic. And I think it's one thing to take a step back on is that we've had a spirited debate, as we just heard most recently in the last panel, informed by science on how the United States should tackle climate change. What are the different options to get on the fastest path to net zero and address issues like systemic racial and labor inequities that have been made worse by pollution and an energy system that distorts inequality. And we've been able to do this because whatever the many flaws that our great country has, there's still protection of free speech and academic freedom and respect for data and analysis and civil disagreement. And while there was agreement on the scope of the challenge we face and the timeline we must meet to mitigate climate change, one of the things that really was great that Todd alluded to with the 4 conversations we had over the last 4 weeks was there was a lot of robust and civil disagreement over how to get there, including what fuels and technologies should be used, what was the timeline in different sectors, who should be in, and if anyone should be excluded from the coalition driving climate and clean energy action, and the policy mechanisms, including maybe a price on carbon or standards and investment that we need to get there. And the common theme of the summit is that addressing climate change goes well beyond merely environmental policy. It's an issue of political economy, and we must treat it as such. Replacing how we power our economy will impact the jobs we have and create, how we live, and the opportunities we have. And if we do it right, with consideration of equity and inclusion that has too often been ignored in the climate advocacy world, this can also have an enormous positive impact on our country, our economy, and our environment. The one challenge I will point out is that, unfortunately, you've heard mostly from members of just one political party, and that was not our preference. We really would have liked to have included more views from both major political parties on their approach to climate change, ways to ensure there's equity and opportunity across regions and races, and the economic implications of strategies informed by different political ideologies. We weren't able to do that nearly to the extent that we wanted to because there is the reality that one party right now is waging a war not on climate change and not against racial injustice, but on science, on fact, and on basic freedoms that allow events like the fastest path to zero to be possible. And I sincerely hope that one of our last panelists, Mike Catanzaro, is right, that the next National Climate Assessment, which is one of the most critical studies of the impact of climate change on the United States, is not delayed. However, the fact that this is even a concern shows that the state that we're currently in is not normal, that it is not politics as usual, and that this is not the fault of both parties. It being an election year or two presidential nominees posturing for political advantage. You know, we started out today with Matt Bennett saying that this is the most important election in our lifetime, and it may sound trite to the point of meaninglessness, but that doesn't make this election any less important. And we need to pause and think for a moment, and I hope people get from the last 4 weeks that there's a lot that we can have a spirited civil disagreement on, but we may not be able to have this kind of event in the future if our fundamental freedoms, the foundation of our country, freedom of speech, access to scientific data, are gone. Action on climate might be completely off the table. There is still time to push back against this. Early voting is ongoing in Michigan, and you can visit michigan.gov/SOS to learn more. If you're not from Michigan, and there are people from across the country that are part of today's event and part of this series, you can visit vote.org and find out where you can vote in your hometown and what early voting eligibility is. You can talk to your friends and family and keep engaged after the election. And visit the Third Way website at thirdway.org for a slate of additional actions you can take to help protect our democracy today. Now, I would have much rather focused the closing of my remarks on recapping the path forward from this last very successful day and from our 4 weeks. But as you know all too well, this year is very different. So thank you so much for joining us today, joining us for previous conversations, and for your commitment and interest in addressing climate change, clean energy, and the inequities that climate change and air pollution and water pollution have brought to too many communities. We really appreciate your engagement. We hope to have you join us in the future as we continue the conversations with the University of Michigan and at Third Way, and we hope that all of you vote. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you, Josh and Todd. We'd like to thank you all for attending Fastest Path to Zero this year, especially in these uncertain times. We will be reaching out to each of you soon to send you a complimentary gift in the coming weeks. If you're interested in more events from Third Way, please check thirdway.org/events. We hope you and your loved ones remain safe and healthy. Goodbye.